I sincerely think Christians should learn Hebrew.
Yeah, it is one of the things that we could do better on.
Yeah.
It is something like there are Christians that do, and we have scholars and things, but like for example, I was thinking about it. If I had to learn like a biblical language, it'd probably be Greek. You know, and there are reasons for that. So, for example, I can get the Hebrew Septuagint translated into Greek.
Yeah.
So, if I learn Greek, I technically have the New Testament and the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I don't have it in a certain way. I don't have it in the original language, but at least I'll have a better understanding of it because the early the apostles used the Septuagint.
Yeah.
So there's even that reason for me to do it.
So I'd go one more than that though, because I think yes, that's absolutely right. The Sahaba, the disciples, they spoke Greek. Spoke Aramaic. I don't know what they convert. Would they have conversed in Greek or Aramaic?
Aramaic, really.
And would they have written down? And this is just me genuinely looking for knowledge. Would they have written down their testaments in Greek or in Aramaic originally?
I'm of the view that they originally wrote it in Greek. There are some people that say, for example, there are scholars that think there may have been a Hebrew version of Matthew.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced by that argument. So I think that most likely would have been Greek, and I think the reason why is because they would have understood at the time to be proselytizing, and given that there are commandments to go and spread this to all nations, to the Gentiles, they would have wrote it in a language that would have travelled furthest, and that would have been Greek.
So I think that's enough. So you believe that you believe Jesus is God?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
And God converse with men.
Yes.
And men converse with those men in Aramaic or Greek?
Aramaic.
And then those men wrote the Aramaic words into Greek. So it's already a
translation.
More than a translation is almost a commentary. So in Judaism we have like the Targum, which is and so when we don't understand the simple meaning of the Hebrew, we'll go to the translations to see how the Onkelos and people of that time. It's okay. Yeah.
Debate mode now.
Right.
I know. I want to pick up him as well. Yeah.
So we go to Onkelos to see what maybe a word means, and Christians will often use this when going to Hebrew scripture. They will go to the Jewish translations to see how they understood the word. You use the Septuagint for that same effect. But so the disciples, because it's communicated from Aramaic, then transcribed and written down in Greek, that's already an interpretation of sorts, because you have to use some sort of intelligence to...
Sure, I agree with that, yeah.
Whereas I assume we both believe that the law of Moses was given in Hebrew, written down in Hebrew. So God spoke face to face with Moses.
Yes.
Moses transcribed the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Torah.
Well, I would say Moses and others.
And so maybe Joshua.
Because I don't believe that Moses wrote his own death.
So that's what I'm saying. Maybe Joshua. Okay. Maybe Joshua wrote the last few verses. And that's a Jewish tradition. Jews are divided. Did Moses prophesy his own death, or did Joshua conclude the final verses? And both are legitimate.
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
So we both believe that God communicated to Moses, or at least the person who received the prophecy wrote down his own words, his own experience of those words in Hebrew.
Yeah.
So we both believe the Hebrew text is divine.
Yeah.
And can we agree that the New Testament, I wouldn't say it started divine, because obviously don't believe Jesus is the Son of God, or God. But we both agreed for definite that the disciples weren't God, and they were interpreting Jesus' words. Right?
It's very bad to say the disciples are God. Yeah. Right.
And so, if the Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, says something that contradicts the New Testament, it would be really important to read that contradiction in its original language, because it's the only book we have preserved in the original language that God communicated.
Okay.
And so to that point, that's why I think it's essential that Christians from a young age learn Hebrew, just like Jewish children. My daughter's 3 years old, she almost speaks as good Hebrew as I do, because I speak terrible Hebrew.
I thought you were going to say she speaks amazing Hebrew like me.
And it's because I wasn't raised in a religious household. I came to religion later in life. My daughter was raised in a religious household. And 5-year-old children will read the Tanakh in its original tongue. And if Christians did that, if there were, first and foremost, you'll be able to buttress your own beliefs. Like you'll be able, okay, I believe this, and I can read it in the original language, and this is why I believe it. Or if there is a contradiction, learning that from a young age before you have all those biases. Like in Cambridge, the Christians study Hebrew. Like in the 1500s, no, Henry VIII set up the first Hebrew colleges in the UK.
Oh, interesting.
And the greatest scholars in Christendom, in England, used to study in Hebrew. At one point, they believed it would be the international language. Christians here were advocating Hebrew should replace Latin because the Protestants thought the Pope was the Antichrist. So we don't want to speak Latin anymore. Let's speak Hebrew. Everyone can speak Hebrew. And unfortunately, that fell out of fashion. But if it hadn't, maybe there'd be less disagreement between Jews and
I do
Christians.
agree with you that it would be better for Christians if they had learned the languages, the biblical languages, so Hebrew, for pretty much the same reasons you've mentioned. I am in alignment with you there. What I want you to ponder on, though, is this perspective. If the New Testament is true, and by that I mean Jesus really is God, and Jesus did come down, and he did talk about prophecies in the Old Testament that he said applied to him, and he also gave his commentary on what the Old Testament was, because we believe he would have known Hebrew, or at least Aramaic, and he would have understood, being God in human form, he would have understood the scriptures. That would have de facto, prima facie, given him the authority to actually interpret the old scriptures. So here's the interesting thing. If you believe the New Testament is true, you necessarily have to believe that whatever Jesus said about it was the correct interpretation of it. So you're right that learning Hebrew helps significantly in knowing the interpretation of things. But if we see a contradiction or a seeming contradiction, because I don't believe there are contradictions, what I would then say is, well, if Christ said it was this way and this is the correct way to interpret it, then that has ultimate authority because, again, I believe he is who he says he is God. So if you kind of think about it, on one perspective, God revealed to Moses this, God then revealed to the disciples in Judea this. You see what I mean? So you end up with an interesting perspective. So that's kind of how the Christians would look at it.
No, that makes perfect sense, but it does leave you in a situation where you can never be critical of the text because... So you can never approach the New Testament from a rational perspective and like, okay, can I falsify this? So as an example, with the Jewish Messiah, which is the key thing we're talking about, it was Jesus. First, was Jesus the Messiah? And then second, what does Messiah mean? But let's just deal with, was Jesus the Messiah? Because we both agree the Old Testament predicts the coming of a Messiah. It's really important for us in this generation today, certainly if you're not a Christian like myself, that you can falsify those prophecies. So the prophecies that the Jews are waiting are falsifiable. So we predict that the temple's going to be rebuilt. That's going to be one of the signs of the Messiah.
Right, yeah.
If it isn't built, we can falsify that. If it is built, we can't. Whereas many of the things with Jesus that Christians will rely on can't be falsified. You can come up with very rational and compelling arguments. And one of the things I've realized coming to the park is Christians have thousands of years, 2,000 years of developing a very strong theology, which is grounded on very strong arguments. And only a fool approaches a conversation thinking that you're not going to have good arguments for my counter-arguments, which is why for me you always have to come back to basic, from a Jewish perspective, back to basics. And those basics, like, are what in the Old Testament is falsifiable in relationship to the Messiah, and
sure.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I wouldn't say that the belief in the New Testament, although it does find a basis in it in the fulfillment of the Old Testament, there are obviously debates about prophecies, which ones are applicable to Jesus, which ones aren't, and then it gets even further than that. So Christians will have things called typologies and Christologies. So then it's things like, was Melchizedek a Christology? Was that something that was meant to resemble the Christ, a sign of him to come later? And we have all these ideas. And to be honest with you, I don't think as a Christian you're actually committed to those. You can have different views on it, and scholars have different views. Some say yes, some say no. I do think there is a genuine concern that you can try and find things because you're desperate to find more things, because it's kind of this thing where if you look for patterns, you will find patterns eventually.
Yes.
And so you need to be able to, as you said, falsify what is correct and what is just what perhaps an overzealous Christian might be like, well, I want to see Christ here and here and here, and I'm going to make the case for all of these things. Well, in reality, it might not be all of it. It might just be some of it.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be humble in recognizing that. There are like traditional arguments, Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, Isaiah 7, Isaiah 9. We can go through all of these things, but I think likewise with a Jewish perspective, the rabbinic Jews also have had an equal amount of time, roughly speaking, to have a counter to all the Christian. And to be honest, I believe in the underdog theory of, if you're not the prevalent dominant demographic, you actually have an advantage in that you have much more of a reason to defend something, because you can't rely on numbers. Like, Christians can become complacent in some things because they can be like, well, it doesn't really matter, how many Orthodox Jews am I actually engaging with? And throughout history, that number is generally over time gone lower, right? I mean, in my life, I don't see many Orthodox Jews, to be fair. It's probably the aspect of the three Abrahamic religions, although whether you say Islam is one is a question. But
I'm okay saying that, but I know maybe your audience are.
I have reasons, but anyway, sure. So I have a lot to learn about that, and I'll be honest about it. Which is why, to be honest, I'm not going to be debate style, because I'd rather just learn, like, for the time being. Maybe in some time in the future, we can have these worn out debates. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned something that's interesting. You said that the Messiah will come after the temple is rebuilt.
So Jews are divided, but they are
divided. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, on most, but the key understanding, everyone agrees that we'll know it's the Messiah because he'll rebuild the temple. So he will be the leader that will rebuild it. Now the division is, and I definitely don't subscribe to this, but I'm not going to speak ill of any Jews that do, and maybe even the majority, that the temple will ascend from heaven, fully formed. And for me, and so I'm not a mystic. I don't do Kabbalah. Jews have a tradition of Kabbalah, but Kabbalah is understood widely today. And for me, it's very clear when you read the Old Testament, when you go to our major rabbis like the Bavli, like Rambam, the temple will be rebuilt, right, and the Mashiach will be the leader at the time who's ultimately responsible for that rebuilding of that temple. Okay. Now that's falsifiable, and that's like, and I think there are other prophecies like the Jews will know Torah. Like, test me, ask me a verse from the Torah, I'll get it wrong.
I thought you were going to say, I'll know it. I'm like, wow.
No, because if I did know it, that's one of our signs that the Messiah's come.
Okay.
And so one of the things I've been humbled is listening to Christian preachers going at it with either their own audience or a layman Jew who's rang up like a Sam Shamoun or someone like that with a little knowledge, and Sam Shamoun's just ran rings round them. Yeah. And you listen to the arguments, and for me, I have to go, okay, well, that's didn't say that coming. Okay, go to the Pesukim, go to the verses. Okay, what are our commentators saying? Okay, now I understand that. But a simple reading, that's a very compelling argument that he's just presented that Jew. And so I think for a Jew it always comes down to, does it contradict the Old Testament? And we both agree the Old Testament is divine. Yeah. And so I think the challenge I put out to you or any people in the comments, because it's not a debate challenge, it's for me to learn. I've been humbled listening to many of your top dogs debating. Are any of the prophecies that you say Jesus, or Christians say Jesus fulfilled, false or Bible? Because you could say, for instance, the resurrection or the tomb was empty, etc. But I can't know that today. There's no way I can't. If the temple's there, it's there. If the Jews know Torah, it's there. If there's world peace, it's there. That's all falsifiable. But are there any, and this isn't there, got you, this is a genuine, do Christians believe they have any examples? Yeah.
So I would actually point to the resurrection of Christ, because I think that's the main one. Yeah. So what I would say ultimately is, scholars, at least for the last 300 years, have been critical of the resurrection. The liberal perspective, the secular world, came out during the Enlightenment period, and since then we've always had scholars who have been like, look, let's analyze this. Did the disciples really believe it? What did they believe? Was it just Jesus' twin? Was it a misunderstanding? Did he actually survive crucifixion? Was the tomb really empty? Did someone steal the body? There's been tons of alternative theories. What I would say the best theory is, the best way of looking at it, would be to explain the evidence through the fact that all of the disciples claim simultaneously to have had visions of him, and those visions of themselves are unique in that psychologists today don't know of any account of two people or more having exactly the same vision. There's no account in modern psychology of two people having exactly the same vision at the same time.
So I'm going to, this is my ignorance. I'm just trying to understand what you're saying. So I don't understand this because I'm a layman on Judaism, so on Christianity I'm like, when you say that, do you mean that the different Gospels, the different books of the New Testament that were written down, all describe the same visions? Like, or was it within one Gospel you have multiple disciples?
So in the Gospels, and also in other places like Acts, for example, and Paul's letters, they'll be talking about the experiences that the disciples had. So basically, Christ was crucified, and then he rose again 3 days later, right? And this is a central part of the Christian belief. So the understanding is that the disciples were actually quite disheartened because they didn't quite understand what they had seen. But then when Christ had rose, he appeared to them in his resurrected body.
And so where's that written?
That's in the Gospels.
So in all of the Gospels?
Yeah, in all of them.
And
actually, Mark cuts off early parts of things. Hey Suraj, I love you, man. We should have a debate.
Yeah, we're gonna have a debate. After this conversation ends, we'll have a debate.
After the conversation ends, you can debate.
Is that fair? You know,
What should we bring? Alright, we'll talk about that in a bit.
We can go quite fast.
sorry.
They're like itching, and he's going to start yapping soon.
So technically, in the Gospel of Mark, it actually ends before it talks about the witnesses, which is a contentious issue in Christianity, actually. The earlier and the longer ending of Mark. Because there are manuscripts that date later that have a longer ending. It's a scholarly issue. Mark 16, verse 9 to 20 is unconfirmed, basically. But in Matthew, Luke, and John, there we have the accounts.
And so when you say the visions are the same, you're saying in each of these accounts it's the same? Or are you also saying within one book itself it will be the same multiple people?
So what I mean by the same visions is they claim to have seen Jesus appear before them. So if you think about it, it would kind of be like if 12 people got together and went, we all saw someone, and now we're convinced that that person is raised from the dead, and now we're going to preach that till we die a horrible death.
I'll tell you where my mind was going with that, where my line of questioning was. If one of the books writes it first, then the others can copy it.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
And so I think
Well, in some element that kind of did happen in the sense that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic gospels, which means that they have a very large amount of the same material, and they get it. What some scholars would say from either an oral or a written source called Q. John comes later. The Johannine Gospel is the most different out of the four. So I have no problem with that personally. It depends what you interpret from that. Does that mean that they were making it up and they were copying, or does it mean that they were writing their own accounts but using material that was familiar to all of them?
So I think it's a really compelling argument, but what I'd bring it back to is we're looking for something that's been falsified. Is something falsifiable?
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't address that.
And then you could address it. So just for the audience, where my mind was going was, we're looking for something that's been falsified, which can be falsified. So if the temple's here today, the third temple, okay, the Messiah must have come.
You are liar! I am Messiah!
He's come!
You are liar! I am Messiah!
We were
Where's
waiting.
your temple?
I am Messiah! You are liar!
He's filming it. Right, sorry.
Muslim copied from Torah and the Bible
I believe
and
that.
put in the Quran.
I believe that.
And that's lie because it was lies.
Well,
And Allah revealed to me, I closed my
the
eyes.
Quran is not true.
And then I was walking in my mosque,
Yeah.
and Allah said, God said, throw the books out except Quran.
Wait. I thought you said the Quran.
That was a
All right,
vision.
I'm
That was
confused.
a vision.
Okay, let's.
I saw, and
Some
I
of his
closed
argument
my
never
eyes.
goes.
Uncle, I hope you're well.
The
No,
Muslims
I'm
copy the
very
Torah,
good.
but follow the
I
Quran
am
as what it
ready
says.
to
I don't
stand
understand.
you
Yeah.
war
I'm
on
very
what
confused.
he said.
Okay.
All right.
So,
I am Messiah. He is a liar.
sir, please,
I am
can
Messiah.
you please go away? We're
You
trying to
don't
make a
believe
video.
in heaven and earth.
No, fine.
You changed Torah,
Yeah.
and Muslim never wrote a word of Bible.
They're
They
terrified.
copied it from
They're
Jeremiah.
terrified when
Messiah.
Jews and Christians try to discuss divinity and who is God, because they know it's going to be compelling arguments, and that's why we're being shouted down.
I am
there's-
Messiah. You are liar. I am Messiah.
It's just.
You are liar.
It's not well.
I am Messiah.
Okay.
You are liar. Officer. Go and learn knowledge, you idiot. I spent 50 years in part of
So,
you are
Okay, so very. So yeah, I don't think we'll be able to sum it up. But my key thing for Christian, I think if any Christian evangelist who wants to convert Jews, and I
I
know
am
that's not our
Messiah.
conversation here.
He is a
If you can bring
liar.
a prophecy that can be
Alhamdulillah.
falsified today, like objectively, like the temple's here, there is world peace, the Jews know the Torah, I think that's the most compelling argument any Christian. No, I don't know.
I agree.
They don't.
Well, I agree. I would actually say the miracle of the resurrection is probably the best way to do that, because the falsifiability of it would be that you would find a body in a tomb where it says Jesus of Nazareth was here, and you find the body. That would falsify our belief.
But there's from that period, most of the Jews that died, we won't be able to find their graves. Never mind that such and such men.
Fair enough, but if you did, it would actually, I would have to, that would destroy my faith, in all honesty. Paul actually says in one of his epistles that if Christ wasn't crucified and resurrected, and if the tomb is not empty, our belief is in vain, and it's all for nothing.
So did you hear that, Rabbi Singer? If you can find the grave, we'll get one of their best. We'll get one of their best from the park at least.
So I guess that to me is probably the clearest example of a falsifiable thing, because you can prove it wrong. That's probably how I'd see it. But
it's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Joe.
It's
Always
never
a pleasure.
even. Peace for my Christian brothers.
God bless you all.